In 2022, Formula One introduced a new technical regulation with which the idea of the leaders of the top category of motorsport was to bring back the ease, to overtake, reduce dirty air, and simplify aerodynamics, and with that, to have legendary wheel-to-wheel battles again. Overall, a Formula One with more exciting battles, races, and on-track action than with the technical regulations that came before. This technical regulation, introduced in 2022, will end after 2025 and be recorded in history. And that means for us that it's time to analyze whether that technical regulation has worked according to the standards that Formula One itself set, or if it hasn't. On the contrary, it has been a complete failure. And with that, Formula One, led by Liberty Media, has taken one of its biggest hits against the wall. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we'll try to discover in this video. So welcome then to the analysis of whether the 2022 technical regulations were a success or a complete failure. To begin these analyses, it's important to know how the technical regulations originated, how they function, and their intended purpose in 2022. Since 2017, the category enforced a technical regulation that lasted until 2021, one with which the cars grew significantly in size. Although that regulation is remembered for bringing the fastest single-seaters in history to Formula One, however, with the increase in size of these cars, many other problems that Formula One already had became much worse. Especially when it comes to overtaking, which became much more complicated with the new width of these vehicles, but also the amount of dirty air these cars generated. Overtaking became very difficult, making Formula One much more reliant on drag reduction system for passing opportunities, which meant that year after year overtaking became more difficult. And as a result, we saw lower quality battles and in some years fewer overtakes. And as a result, the on-track action was of lower quality. Overtaking with these single-seaters had become much harder. So Liberty Media, who took over Formula One in 2017, proposed the creation of a regulation to solve the dirty air problems on the grid. Bringing back a category with daily battles, subscribe to the channel. Usually, the loyal one drafts the technical regulations, while the Formula One management, the commercial rights owner, previously had little involvement in their creation, at least historically speaking. But to design this regulation, they relied heavily on the opinion of Ross Brown, who at that time served as the sporting director of the category, after the purchase by Liberty Media. The idea behind this regulation was to simplify aerodynamics and redirect dirty air to prevent it from hitting the chasing cars with force. Reduce turbulence to help cars follow each other closely, making overtaking easier. For that, as I told you, the idea was to simplify aerodynamics and use the car structures to redirect all that dirty air so that it would pass over the chasing car. The 2022 technical regulations included these changes to achieve this. Make the front wing simpler to reduce its ability to manage air from the front wheels. The removal of barge boards that directed air through the car. Using wheel covers to reduce dirty air from brakes. And the most important topic of all was the return of ground effect. That is, the floors of the cars would be made up of tunnels, venturi, becoming the part that would now generate most of the car's downforce, and where thanks to those venturi tunnels, along with the diffuser, thanks to the philosophy of these cars, the dirty air would be redirected to the rear of the car. As I said, thanks to the diffuser. Throw the dirty air as high as possible to avoid hitting the car behind. This reduces dirty air's impact on chasing single-seaters, letting them follow more easily and making overtaking easier. The goal proposed by Formula One with the design of these cars was extremely simple, summarized in 5 points that Formula One itself proposed. The main goal is to make wheel-to-wheel racing easier by letting cars get closer to rivals. The second point was that simplification would create more competitive grids and narrow the gap between cars. The third point aimed to boost the sport's financial health and lower costs. The fourth point was to create cars that are easy to develop, and the fifth point to have visually attractive cars, appealing and extremely exciting. So, to understand whether these regulations have been a success or a failure, we have to understand if they achieved what Formula One itself proposed, or if on the contrary, they have failed, in all the areas that were proposed. To do this, let's start with those that were a complete success. And the two areas that were a success are having visually attractive and exciting cars and improving the financial health of the teams. It's true, taste is very subjective and some people may like these cars and others may not, but with these single-seaters, the general consensus, according to surveys from motorsport websites and forums dedicated to motorsports, is that the cars are exciting visually speaking and aesthetically quite beautiful. Surveys show most Formula One fans think changing these cars was a good decision. Their radical, futuristic, aggressive design is impressive, and for some, much better than previous years. On the financial health side of the sport, as we discussed in the video analyzing Liberty Media's work since they acquired Formula One. Thanks to the budget cap, the increase in Formula One viewership, and the rise in profits that Liberty Media has experienced, Formula One teams consistently profit from participating in the category each year. Although this obviously started before the arrival of the technical regulations, it's undeniable that it has worked. These regulations improve Formula One as financial health, helping teams achieve the profitability they sought from participating. In these two areas, the 2022 regulations have been successful. But what really matters, or mostly matters, was how these cars performed on track. So let's move on to the third point proposed by Formula One itself, starting with the first one. Let's see if these regulations succeeded in making cars easy to develop. I think we're all aware here that this is a resounding no, right? These cars were extremely complex from their very first design. Because ever since these regulations were written, even Formula One itself didn't take into account the problems that would come and become a headache for teams and drivers. The most important of these was porpoising, which for a good part at the beginning of these regulations caused problems that hampered the performance of many cars. It was also a health issue for some drivers who exited their cars with severe back pain. Porpoising was a bouncing phenomenon caused by ground effect, and for some teams, on certain circuits in particular, this bouncing was extremely aggressive. Only a few people foresaw this problem, which even Formula One greatly downplayed, and many teams had to invest a large part of their car development in minimizing these problems. Some teams were misled by potential aerodynamic downforce gains they couldn't maintain because of the car's bouncing issues. Just like what happened to Mercedes with the W13, the bouncing problems became such an important issue for driver safety that by the Belgian Grand Prix, measures were taken, supposedly to prevent health problems for the drivers, motivated by complaints from teams such as Mercedes. They ended up raising the cars off the ground to minimize the bouncing issue, and the cars stopped running so close to the asphalt, which for Poster ended up affecting the philosophy of these designs and to some extent the show on the track. Another issue was these cars were highly complex to develop, as many teams' development packages actually made them worse. And that led to two major eras of dominance: the Red Bull era in 2022 and 2023, and now the McLaren era in 2025. Those with the right design philosophy won easily, with teams following their lead. When they fell into the cycle of failed upgrades, they ended up losing any hope of putting up a fight. And thanks to the budget cap, it was almost impossible to correct failed design philosophies, and many teams ended up focusing on the cars for upcoming seasons to maximize resource and research investment. The ground effect era featured cars that were hard to develop and brought unforeseen problems to Formula One once racing began. This ultimately resulted in three major eras of dominance, exactly what Formula One wanted to avoid. So in this particular area, we have the first major failure, a failure of this technical regulation. But anyway, let's move on to the next particular point and see if it had a bit more luck there. This regulation created a more balanced, competitive grid. Formula One Solo 2024 was an exceptional case due to Red Bull's drop and the rise of McLaren and Ferrari. Due to this regulation's technical complexity, when a team had a technical advantage over the years, it was almost impossible for others to catch up, unless their design philosophies started to fail, just like what ended up happening with Red Bull. So at least in that regard, you couldn't say that the grid closed up and became more competitive, at least among the leading group. However, the midfield is now more balanced in the 2025 season, enabling open competition among several teams in this group. In addition, the qualifying sessions have been extremely close in this ground effect era, where sometimes even the dominant teams could be beaten in this session. Often, this made qualifying sessions more exciting than the races themselves. And in this 2025, we're seeing that things have been very similar to what has characterized this entire ground effect era. A dominant team, thrilling qualifying sessions, and a close midfield with many evenly matched battles. Why rate this category? It's been an era of dominance rather than evenly matched top groups, with 3 other teams at the top as pursuers, resigned to simply being the runners-up, but with a rather changeable middle group. From my particular point of view, this is a failure for me, since Formula 1 hasn't improved the show compared to what we saw under the old regulations. And the goal was for the whole grid to get closer together, but they've only managed to bring the middle group closer, clearly separated from the front, and a front that's been clearly dominated by one unbeatable team throughout the entire season. From my perspective, I think that aspect has also failed. But well, there was a main objective. With this regulation, cars could follow each other closely, wheel-to-wheel battles would return, and overtakes and race quality would improve. So, have they succeeded in implementing this technical regulation on this point? Well, let's start by comparing it with the technical regulation introduced in 2017. Estimates from statistics websites show there were over 4,500 overtakes from 2017 to 2021. The lowest year for overtakes was 2017 with 435 passes, while the highest was 2019 with 1,220 overtakes. 2017 had 431 on-track overtakes, and 2021 had 807, the fewest in any season. The years were 2019 with 1,220 overtakes and 2018 with 1,056. It should be clarified that these figures are approximate, since each source has its own methodology, where some exclude overtakes on the first lap, others take team orders into account, others don't, and so on. So let's take these figures as an approximate estimate. The new technical regulations failed to exceed 1,000 overtakes in any season. 2022 had approximately 785 overtakes. 858 and 2024 had a total of 788. We'll have to see what numbers we end up with in 2025. Only one season with these technical regulations is better than the second. 2021 had the fewest total overtakes under the old technical regulations. But with very low numbers if you compare the total overtakes we had in 2019 and 2018. It's true, at the start of these technical regulations, cars followed each other more easily. Even during that year's preseason and season start, drivers said the car's behavior when chasing rivals hadn't changed much. Compared to 2021, how did the car handle dirty air? Each year, these cars produced more dirty air, increasing its effects over time. We've heard many complaints about how hard it is to chase a car due to all the dirty air these single-seaters create. In the middle of 2025. As I mentioned at the start of the regulations, the changes appeared to have small but positive aspects over the years. Safety-driven technical regulations such as those at the 2022 Belgian Grand Prix, the TD039, significantly diluted the original benefits of these designs. And in the end, the amount of dirty air coming off the cars meant that the same problem from 2021 was still present, along with the difficulty of chasing rivals. Yes, this regulation was introduced due to Mercedes' complaints about excessive car bouncing. They were partially responsible for the regulation's failure in the area they aimed to improve. Since racing the cars to minimize the bouncing effect reduced their ability to generate downforce through the floor, the teams had to rely on other aerodynamic devices to generate the downforce they were losing. This ultimately affected the dirty air issue. So, if we take into account that the number of overtakes hasn't improved, the quality of the battles has rarely been better than what we've seen in previous years. And since the cars are still facing the same problems chasing rivals that we saw in 2021, we can understand that in this area, they have also failed in what they set out to do. And to all this, we must also add the fact that races in the rain are now practically impossible. These cars kick up so much spray by redirecting air that it creates endless walls of water, greatly reducing visibility. So, a problem that began with the previous technical regulations has worsened in this ground effect era, because these regulations not only failed to create more battles and overtakes, but also made existing problems worse. So in this area, these regulations are also a failure, which makes their points clear, the purpose of their implementation, and the most important objectives, as a complete failure. We had periods of dominance in 3 out of the 4 seasons teams that faced tremendous difficulties understanding their cars and updating them. Unanticipated problems like porpoising, which also became a driver health issue. The same difficulties in chasing cars and once again struggling with the issue of dirty air, in addition to making races in the rain practically impossible. Like I told you, this was already a problem, but it was made worse by these regulations whose goal was to push the air as high up as possible. With the water, it created curtains that made it practically impossible for the drivers to see. So, Taking into account everything mentioned before, there's no other conclusion than to realize that these regulations were a failure, mainly due to unforeseen problems from their regulations' inception. That issue was mainly porpoising, which Formula One already knew about from the 1980s ground effect era. Its aggressive emergence in 2022 was completely unexpected for them and most teams. Even with wind tunnels and simulation tools, they could never see it coming and they could never predict it. This created a snowball effect, making it impossible for these regulations to achieve all their intended objectives. So, without overtaking, close battles, or the ability to follow each other easily, the conclusion is clear. The 2022 technical regulations, it was a resounding failure and the first major failure of Formula One since Liberty Media took over the category in 2017.